in Protestantism, we don't talk about this. Isn't part of our like theology discussion. Catholicism speaks on it a lot. It's called the Annunciation. The Annunciation is that point at which Mary says, "Here I am." And it's basically the conception, the point at which, when did the Holy Spirit cover, overshadow Mary? Catholicism's assertion of this is through what they call the oh, come on, how I just talked about it. The Annunciation. Sorry, that is the moment this occurs, when she says yes. And their argument is because the next thing we know, she's on the road visiting her cousin, who immediately notices she's can tell she's not showing. There's no visible evidence at this point, and yet Mary is able, or Elizabeth is able to look at Mary, and because of what's happening in her womb, because John is reacting to being in the presence here, that's triggering something. So the Annunciation is another one of those things that I think the pendulum swung too far. It was too much associated with Mary, so the Protestants threw it to the side. I, that the overshadowing is not a process. It's not this gradual journey. It is simply an act. Um, now, where am I at? Oh, now Mary's song of praise is how my Protestant Bible puts it. In the Catholic Bible, it would call this the Magnificat, and this is probably my favorite section of Scripture. So, Brad, don't say anything to get me riled up just yet. I'm riled enough. I'm riled enough. And Mary said, this is verse 46, and Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely," and lowliness just means humanity, that I am no one special here. I am just a person living a life who has been holding out on a promise the same way a lot of other people have. That lowliness isn't some like defeatist thing. It's just the realization of who am I. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the mighty one has done great things for me. For is not a great translation. Has done mighty things in and through me is the preposition. And holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him. Keep fear in context, right? We're talking about for those who have an awareness, an awakening, and a concept of identity found in him. Yeah, from fear, from generation to generation, he has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He's brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever. And Mary remained with her, Elizabeth, about 3 months and then returned home. By the time Mary returns home, she would be showing. Um, are you familiar with the novelist Anne Rice? Anne Rice is a fascinating figure. She writes a lot of books that a lot of Christians take issue with. She writes mostly about vampires, witches. That is her genre, is like sci-fi, supernatural stuff. Anne Rice converts to Catholicism in 15 years before she passed away. And she does nothing halfway. Anne Rice converts and hires a priest to be her personal priest. He lives in her home and he basically tutors her on anything she wants to learn. And it just so happens that this priest is a devotee of the Catholic Universalist theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. So her theology is far more in keeping with what you and I believe than traditional Catholicism. Um, she produces a couple books, a book and like a novella after this period. And the first is out of Egypt or something along those lines. But the basic, it's what occurs from Jesus. He's born and then they leave. They flee to Egypt. What did his time in Egypt look like? And she pulls on history and what available mythology within the early church there was about what that time looked like for him. We don't have a lot of info. within Scripture. So she extrapolates a lot, but it's a beautifully written book. She also has a novella that she wrote that extrapolates what Mary and Elizabeth would have talked about during the 3 months they're together. Where John's 3 months, that's the 9-month mark for Elizabeth. The logic likely is Mary staying there is almost like midwife. You're there to help your family member through the final phase of the birth. But she also is with child at the same time. There's something happening within her. And I encourage you to check both of them out. Anne Rice was a phenomenal writer. And both books, again, a lot of conjecture because we have very little data to build on. But that nevertheless makes for a phenomenal story in the hands of someone who, at that time in her life, is increasingly becoming aware of the goodness of God and the inherent nature of what He's doing. I'm finishing up my thoughts here and then kind of want to open it up to you all. I'm waiting to see if it's Amanda or Joel. Amanda's the winner. We
Technically, Brad already won.
That's true. Well done, Brad. Brad, ever shaking up things, ever ensuring the peace by simply taking things in control. Well done. Mary and the process, the role she plays in this is noteworthy. It is significant. And honestly, it's so significant, I can only interpret the refusal to acknowledge it as some form of sexism, as some form of wanting to downplay the role that a female plays in this process. And if we think about as masculinely centered as Catholicism as a religion is, in the sense that there's only so high a woman in the faith can progress. The lowliest of priests outranks the highest of nuns. In Protestantism, there's entire sections that won't even let women like take care of teenagers in a spiritual capacity. You can teach the really young, but once they're of that age of, what do they call that? The age of consent, or the age of the point at which you're able to make a decision for yourself and God holds you accountable whether you're going to hell or not. Some absurdity. I probably blocked it out of my head from trauma or something.
Accountability.
Age of accountability. Thank you, Brad. Once that's achieved, there are sections of the Protestant faith, particularly some of our more conservative Baptist brethren, where women can't even teach teenage men. They can teach teenage women, that's fine, but not teenage men. So as restrictive as we can look at Catholicism and say that there's a sexist element of women can only rise this high and the lowliest of ecclesiastical men outrank the highest of ecclesiastical women, it still is a sight better than what passes within fundamentalist evangelicalism, where women literally have no role. They are to birth children and shut up. And that was, I put that much harsher than I intended, but I stand by it. I stand by it. So I think there is a sexism element here of to acknowledge Mary is to acknowledge the role of what God is doing in women, and that He is capable of moving and thriving and expressing Himself through them as equally as He is a man. And honestly, let's acknowledge the simple biologics of this. What Mary does, only a woman could do. The significance of this, there is no man who could pull this off. That this was exclusively something that God was going to move upon a female to produce and bring forth. God moving through our ignorance. That I and those of you who are GGS students, this is a lecture you've heard many times, so I will abbreviate this. What grinds my gears, what really gets on my last nerve, is a prevailing and increasingly loud view in grace that the Old Testament is irrelevant. No, it is not. It is the story of man's attempt to understand God, miss the mark in that understanding, and in his goodness show up every time in the midst of that and try it again. I said this, you heard this, let me explain this again. Over and over and over again. The Old Testament is a visible demonstration of God's faithfulness amidst our ignorance. We try, we get confused, and he steps in and says, I'm not quitting. We're going to explain this again. Let's go through this again. Um, he meets us in our ignorance, and the Old Testament, that is its theme. That we try, we confuse, we don't know what we're doing, we completely run from ditch to ditch, and each time God steps up and says, "Okay, let's get you back on track here. Let me try and explain myself one more time." What you're describing, Amanda, is essentially a failure of catechesis, and there's another word that we don't talk about in Protestantism. Um, Catechesis is just the process of learning a catechism, a statement of faith, an understanding of who God is and how he interacts with us. I was raised Methodist. And in Methodism, we had a catechism. You had to learn it. I was baptized as a baby. And then in my probably 10 or 11, I started doing catechism classes with Reverend Lawton, who was the kindest man in the world and also the most boring human being on the planet. The fact they ever let this man teach children is insane. The only thing I remember from the 10 to 15 catechism classes I had to go to on Sunday night, when I would much rather be doing almost anything in the world, to listen to the most boring human being on the planet, was that Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, and thus sprung our faith. That's what I remember. So until I am a young adult in seminary, I am still harboring this belief that essentially Protestantism is entirely about wanting to get a divorce. Now, again, Methodists are a branch of Anglicans, and so yeah, their history does directly connect to Henry VIII wants a divorce. The Catholic Church won't give it to him, and so he embraces Protestantism and the Reformers because he can convince them to give him license to get a divorce and also license to chop the head off his second wife, and kill another one too. I don't remember which one, Catherine Parr maybe. Anyway, that's what I took away from all those classes. Not the nature of the creed, not the inherent beliefs of the church. My takeaway from 8 to 15 classes of catechism was my faith is entirely built upon Henry VIII wanting a divorce. And what the heck am I supposed to do with that now? Um, when we don't, when we make everything little witticisms, little catchy phrases that sound really neat and they're quotable and memorable, but they don't tie to anything. It may get someone to show up the following week. It may be effective in the short term in that capacity, but we still then produce an entire generation that has no idea what they're not. No one's there to tell you what you are believing. I should phrase it. Only you know what you actually believe to be true, but they don't even lay out very well a framework for you of what the faith believes, of what the tradition believes. So there's an adage that in France more people identify as being Catholic than Christian, and it baffles like Gallup and those pollsters, because how can Catholicism is a branch of Christianity? How can there be more people who say they are Catholic than identify as being Christian? Well, because if you're French, you're Catholic unless you voluntarily like convert to Protestantism. You're Catholic by birth. You were baptized, by somebody. You don't ever really attend mass, and you don't even know if there's a God, but you're Catholic because you were baptized a Catholic. Um, a restoration of catechism, I think, is something that we're starting to see on the horizon. And whether we have to use that word because it's loaded again, if you depending on your tradition, you hear catechism, you hear Catholic. despite the fact that every faith within Christianity has a catechism. Even to the point, the Pentecostal Holiness Church, if you're familiar at all with them, they're part of the holiness movement. Until the 1990s, they had in their their guidebook of ministry, like this is like their governing documents. They had their catechism. They called it that catechism, and it was, we believe in God. We believe, it was this um, functionally going through the creed is that very thing. This is a process of catechesis. It's a process of identifying this is what the church has historically believed, and here's what we do with that. And I think we mentioned in the very first one, that is the nature of what the Apostles' Creed is. It's not a creed that gets written down by a group or by official meetings like the Nicene Creed and the Athanasian Creed and others that came after. It originates organically because bishops, those governing regions, had to have some kind of a general system to, okay, how do we articulate what we believe to new converts, particularly those who don't come from a Judaic world, who may not even be monotheistic. They're not even accustomed to there being one God. So how do we explain this faith to them so that they understand what they're connecting to? I think there's benefit to returning to that model, of taking the time to actually learn what those who came before us believed, and then come to whatever conclusions we individually come to. But I think it's a tragedy that we can be brought up within a system and have no idea what that system actually believes because it did such a poor job of articulating. One could argue she shares a responsibility for him for 33 years. Because Joseph passes from the scene at some point between the exile into Egypt and they return, and then where the story picks up again, where all of a sudden Jesus is an adult now, starting, he's at 30-year mark or so, starting his earthly ministry. All we know is that at some point in those 30 years, Joseph dies. And yet, because Jesus has siblings, we know Joseph was there for quite a while. It's not as if he died quickly. He's also significant enough that I think it's Matthew in the birth chronology, the family history that traces back to the beginning. Um, when when Matthew does that, it does not trace it to Mary. Matthew traces to Joseph. And the article from Barclay talks about that. That causes some confusion. It suggests that maybe the writer of Matthew, the time that's happening, the idea of the fullness of the virgin birth may not have been fully comprehended. But nevertheless, Joseph is significant enough that the gospel retains his lineage as going back to King David, and back further. But Jesus is the son of David. He is the full demonstration of the kingdom of David's kingdom restored, not primarily through Mary, but through Joseph, through his stepfather. And I think there's something beautiful about that to me. That it's not just who births you, it's not just who who makes the deposit. It's the one who is responsible for you. We know for a fact, based on the narratives and even the church history, Eusebius talks about this. We know that whatever Joseph's profession was, and there's dispute. The carpentry thing is a word that could mean carpentry. It can also mean like a stone cutter, which would have been much more common based on the geography of where Nazareth is. Never, and there certainly was an adequate call in Egypt for stone cutters, whereas carpentry, most of their furniture in Egypt was stone, not wood. So you can see why carpentry could just mean a maker of furniture and not, so the language gets confusing. Whatever Joseph's profession was, that is the profession Jesus was trained in. He is learning from Joseph the way every son would learn from their father. And so I don't think we have to, in the same way that the Protestantism swung the pendulum, went into the other ditch, and pretends Mary doesn't matter. We don't want to make that same mistake with Joseph. Um, just because he is not the deposit by which Jesus comes to be, he is still the one who was chosen by God. God could have intervened. He could have not appeared to Joseph. I mean, not sent an angel and let Joseph do what he was going to do, which was divorce her quietly, meaning break the engagement privately so as not to embarrass her. And he's going to go and marry somebody else and he'll wish her well. And let's be clear, Joseph and Mary were an arranged marriage. They did not choose one another, their parents chose each other. So, but by every did they love one another? I can't, hypothesize that as much as any couple did in that day, I would assume. But we can't read it through our lens of where you choose your spouse. And no, this was an arranged marriage. Joseph could have turned the other way, um, and been perfectly fine. He would have married somebody else. He would have had other children. Still been a stonemason. Would have still raised his male sons to be stonemasons or carpenters. Nothing would have changed for Joseph. Um, but what God reveals himself to Joseph, because as important as it was for Mary to bring Jesus forth, it arguably was just as important to the father that Joseph would be the man to raise his son. Um, we Two things can be true at once. We cannot elevate these people to being divine and yet equally acknowledge the incredible significance of what they've done. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can acknowledge their beauty and their worth without deifying them. Because we don't comprehend an engagement process like what Israel experiences and what most of the human history has experienced. Like to bring up Henry VIII again, um, that's how he gets out of some of his marriages. Is he's able to make an argument that the woman was engaged to someone else when she agreed to marry him, and that engagement had not officially been declared null and void. Therefore, her marriage to him was invalid because she was actively engaged to somebody else. We don't talk or think that way. It, engagement practically means nothing in contemporary society. People are engaged multiple times before they get married. Sometimes they even jump the gun and they get engaged after a couple dates, and all to that goes to nothing, and then they engage to somebody else. That's we don't think that way. That's not innately to the way we engage with relationship. Engagement was all but marriage. The issue here isn't that Mary's pregnant. It was not uncommon that pregnancy would occur within the engagement period. What's of concern is it's not Joseph's, and he knows it. He knows what has not occurred, therefore he knows it cannot be his. So think of how easy it would have been for Joseph to just claim it as his. Again, there's no stigma within their culture of an engaged couple becoming pregnant. That is not what it is to us, where we would think of that's not married. To them, it was a phase in the transition. As many did get pregnant during engagement as did not. So this is by no means a stigma to them in their culture. So it's not a matter of Mary being pregnant, it's that it's not Joseph's. And he's willing to, one, try and divorce her quietly, but he's going to have people know they were engaged. It's a public event. And he's going to have to explain why they're not engaged anymore, and he'll find a polite way to do it. But how easy would it have just been to claim the pregnancy as yep, that's my kid? The amount of integrity you have to invite trouble, to invite judgment, all because you are not going to tell a lie. You are not going to just go with the flow for the sake of it not being embarrassing. Yeah, the issue here isn't that Mary's pregnant; it's that Joseph isn't the father, and he knows it. The church goes through the Reformation. So we're talking 16th century, right? when the church goes through the Reformation, there's debate as to what of the festivals and holidays of the Catholic Church and even of the Orthodox Church that goes before, that were there before the schism, what to keep, what to retain, and what we should get rid of. And Luther makes a really strong argument for why the Feast of Saint Joseph, which is in March, it's right around Saint Patrick's Day. I think it's like a couple days before, like the 15th or something like that. But Luther makes a really strong argument for keeping it, um, in that we cannot acknowledge the church, both Jesus, who is the head, and James and Jude, who are the body through which the church in Jerusalem, uh, it's undisputed. The church in Jerusalem looks to James, not Peter. It looks to James for leadership. And yeah, because we're reading a New Testament that's filled with a lot of epistles by Paul, there's a lot of times that we can come away with a bad taste in our mouth about James and the Judaizers, and the it's nevertheless James who sits down with Paul and basically says, look, they don't have to get circumcised, that they hear Paul's argument. When Paul goes to Jerusalem to try and talk to the Jerusalem church, it's James he has to convince. And it ends with James fully embracing the Gentile converts. So I don't think it's fair that the burden we put on James because we don't like certain sections of his epistle and that it contradicts Paul or something. But no, James seems by all account to be what the church hinges itself on, for a very significant portion of time.